Passion is often celebrated as something magnificent, a vital impulse that drags us out of routine and makes us feel alive. But what if, behind all this fervor, there was an invisible trap? Nietzsche warns us that where there is passion, there is always also a struggle of forces, a will to dominate, a subtle game of power. What we call surrender might actually be the beginning of submission. And what we think is absolute love might hide the renunciation of our own will. How many times have you confused intensity with truth? How many times did you believe you were rising when you were actually bending? Nietzsche doesn't invite us to abandon passion, but to strip it naked, to see what pulses beneath the mask of beauty and desire, because only this way is it possible to transform what imprisons us into creative force. And if passion wasn't freedom, but servitude, if this question stirs something in you, subscribe to the channel and walk with me on this philosophical journey that could change how you see your relationships and your own life. Passion arrives like a storm. At first, it doesn't ask permission, it just takes over. The body trembles, the heart races, thoughts seem to spin around a single presence, a single desire. It's as if suddenly the world became more colorful, more alive, more intense. Nietzsche knew this initial impulse has something vital, almost Dionysian about it. Its life showing its strength, its existence ceasing to be mere repetition to transform into vertigo. Whoever has never experienced this almost feverish state believes they are, for the first time, truly living. And it's precisely this overwhelming power of passion that makes it seem like freedom. Routine loses meaning, work seems distant, and every gesture of the other, the look, the voice, the silence, acquires the force of an oracle. Everything seems to indicate that we've finally found what was missing. It's in this instant that many believe passion is a form of liberation, a break from the coldness of daily life, an escape from monotony. Nietzsche, however, would warn us not to confuse intensity with freedom, because what is rapture can also be illusion. When we feel passionate, we have the sensation that we've conquered something magnificent, but the truth is that often we are the ones being conquered. Passion promises transcendence, but hides within itself the possibility of slavery. Think about how many times someone, taken by desire, abandoned their personal projects, friendships, or even their values in the name of a we that seemed bigger than their own I. This is passion's fascination. It convinces us that by surrendering to the other, we are freeing ourselves. But is this surrender actually freedom? Nietzsche saw in passion fertile ground for understanding what he called the will to power, that force that inhabits all of us and seeks to affirm itself, expand itself, conquer space. To love, to desire, to want to be with someone is also to want to be part of something greater. But at the same time we grow in this encounter, we risk diminishing ourselves. The danger is subtle because it presents itself seductively. We believe we are choosing, when in reality we are being dragged. Some say that without passion, life loses its flavor. And perhaps it's true. Nietzsche never proposed a cold or intensity-free existence. On the contrary, he celebrated life as a dance between forces, as something that must be lived with intensity and courage. The problem arises when this intensity becomes a weight that enslaves us, when the other becomes the center around which we orbit, when our will ceases to be ours, when we stop listening to ourselves because the heart only beats to someone else's frequency. At this point, passion has already begun to distort itself. Imagine the scene. A person decides to change their habits, clothes, way of speaking, just to please the one they love. At first, it seems like a gesture of affection, dedication. But little by little, the self disappears, and what remains is a shadow of oneself, someone who lives through another's eyes. Nietzsche would remind us that behind this gesture, there isn't just love, but also submission. Passion's fascination, which seemed like a promise of freedom, becomes a disguise for imprisonment. And the most intriguing thing is that this trap isn't imposed from outside. It's not necessarily the other who demands submission. Often we ourselves offer ourselves as sacrifice, as if believing that passion requires renunciation were part of its ritual, as if loving inevitably meant losing oneself. This belief, deeply rooted, is perhaps one of the greatest illusions Nietzsche invites us to deconstruct, because if we look closely, we'll see that passion always brings with it an ambiguous invitation. It can be a call to grow and transform, but it can also be the beginning of a slow dissolution of one's own identity. It's up to each of us to discern which path we're following. Nietzsche didn't want us to fear passion, but to look at it without masks, to set aside the romantic illusions that treat it as pure enchantment and see in it what it really is, a vital force, both creative and dangerous. The initial fascination can be transformative as long as it doesn't convert into prison. Passion, when conscious, can expand life. When blind, it can reduce us to servants of a desire that is no longer ours. And perhaps the question that remains in the end is this: when you think about the passions you've lived, how many of them were actually freedom? And how many were just the beginning of a silent submission? Nietzsche believed that behind all our actions, desires, and feelings, there exists something deeper than simply seeking pleasure or avoiding pain. He called this force the will to power. It's not just the desire to command others, but an essential tendency of life, to expand itself, to affirm itself, to conquer space. And when we look at passion through this lens, we perceive something disturbing. To love, to desire, to surrender to someone is never just donation or innocent surrender. There is always, in a veiled way, a struggle of forces. Passion, when it's born, seems pure. We feel we've found something outside ourselves, something that completes us. But what's at stake is always also the impulse to affirm oneself through the other. When we desire someone, we don't just seek their company. We seek to possess them in some way, to have them as part of our existence. To love is also to want the other to mold themselves to our world, for them to become mirror or extension of what we are. This doesn't mean that all love is explicit tyranny, but that passion, in its essence, carries a dimension of power. Nietzsche knew this would shock romantic conceptions, because we learn to believe that passion is a state of purity, of absolute surrender, almost a fusion of souls. But if we look carefully, we'll see that what we call surrender is rarely complete detachment. There's always a hidden expectation. We want to be reciprocated. We want to be admired. We want to be needed. Even the most generous gesture in love carries to some extent a desire for return. Passion, thus, is not only altruism, but also an affirmation of self. A simple example: someone who falls deeply in love with a free-spirited person who doesn't bind themselves to conventions. At first, this freedom enchants, but over time, the desire to mold, to domesticate, to transform that freedom into something safer emerges. What seemed pure admiration becomes an attempt at control. What was once attractive for being untamable now awakens fear of loss. And it's in this moment that passion reveals its character of will to power. We want the other to be free, but only to the point where their freedom doesn't threaten our possession. This doesn't happen only in romantic relationships. The same logic appears in passion for ideas, projects, even causes. When we become passionate about a worldview, we often want others to embrace it too. We desire them to share our flame, our faith. Passion, in any field, tends to transform into an impulse for expansion, into an attempt to impose on others what burns within us. It's life trying to affirm itself, to multiply itself. Nietzsche didn't see this as necessarily negative. He didn't condemn the will to power because he believed it was inevitable. It's the engine of existence, what pushes us forward. The problem is when we're not conscious of it, when we believe our passion is just surrender, when we deceive ourselves with the idea that we're just serving, loving, giving ourselves. In this self-deception, we lose the chance to transform passion into something creative. We become hostages to a power dynamic we pretend doesn't exist. That's why Nietzsche was so suspicious of traditional morality and discourses that romanticize love. He knew that often sweetness and devotion hide invisible disputes, tensions that disguise themselves as tenderness. To love can be to care, but it can also be to dominate subtly. Love that demands exclusivity, love that cannot bear distance, love that needs to be reciprocated at any cost, all reveal, to greater or lesser degree, the will to power acting under passion's veil. Think about how many times in loving you expected the other to think like you, act as you'd like, be available exactly when you needed them. How many times wasn't it the desire for freedom that spoke loudest, but the desire for possession? This is the portrait of a passion that, instead of being pure freedom, functions as an invisible network of expectations and demands. Nietzsche would say that recognizing this is the first step to not being devoured by one's own passion. Because when we see passion as will to power, we stop being naive. We begin to understand that the game of love is never just union, but also confrontation, and that instead of denying this struggle of forces, we need to learn to dance with it. The greater risk is believing there exists a love totally free of power, totally innocent. This illusion makes us fragile because it prevents us from seeing reality as it is. Passion always brings within itself a hidden battle, between wanting and being wanted, between dominating and yielding, between expanding oneself and losing oneself. The question isn't to deny this battle, but to ask, are we conscious of it, or are we merely toys in its hands? There's a silent instant in passion when the flame, once vibrant and expansive, begins to change nature. At first, everything seems intensity, discovery, affirmation of life. But the point comes when desire, instead of expanding the self, begins to bend it. It's when passion crosses its invisible border and begins to transform into submission. This moment is rarely perceived clearly. It insinuates itself gradually, hidden in gestures of care, in apparently small concessions, in renunciations that seem harmless. But each renunciation carries within itself a seed of erasure. Nietzsche would say this turn doesn't happen because passion is false, but because we forget to look at its essence. To love isn't just to desire, it's also to enter a field of forces. And in this field, someone always yields more, someone always renounces more. It's in this imbalance that passion begins to corrode individuality. When a person gives up their tastes, convictions, projects to live in function of the other, passion's flame has already converted into shadow. A banal but revealing example, someone who loved traveling alone, knowing new places, experiencing creative solitude, but upon falling in love begins to avoid this habit because the partner doesn't share this taste. At first, it's just a practical choice, a gesture of love. But over time, this choice becomes rule, and the person who once affirmed themselves through freedom now molds themselves to fit another's expectation. This is the beginning of submission, when the other's desire becomes more important than our own. The most disturbing thing is that often whoever submits believes they're living love's peak. They confuse renunciation with devotion, silence with harmony, dependence with surrender. Nietzsche would mistrust this confusion because in it there's a denial of one's own being. He would remind us of his maxim, "Become who you are." Passion, when it becomes submission, impedes this process because it forces us to be what the other expects, not what we truly are. This process can be perceived in different intensities. There are those who lose themselves completely, nullifying their own voice in the name of the relationship. But there are also subtle forms of submission, like when someone avoids expressing their opinions to avoid conflict, or accepts uncomfortable situations just to preserve the illusion of harmony. Passion, in this case, acts as a filter. Everything is seen through the other's lens, and the self is slowly erased. Nietzsche would invite us to ask, why do we do this? Why do we choose to silence ourselves, to bend, to reduce ourselves? Perhaps because there exists a deep fear of losing, fear of solitude, fear of abandonment, fear of discovering we're not as strong as we'd like to believe. Thus, passion transforms into a prison we voluntarily accept, because the alternative, solitary freedom seems even more frightening. But there's something even darker. Often, it's not just fear. It's also pleasure. There exists a strange satisfaction in losing oneself in the other, in dissolving in their presence, in living to please. Nietzsche would point to this as a sign of decadence, as weak will that prefers to renounce itself instead of affirming itself. It's as if, incapable of bearing the weight of one's own freedom, the person chooses the relief of submission. To love becomes, in this case, a form of abdication. This process doesn't happen only in romantic relationships. It can be seen in any intense passion, for career, for an idea, for a belief. How many people don't sacrifice their health, bonds, their own joy in the name of a vocation or a mission? Surrender, when blind, repeats the same pattern. The self bends before something greater, and submission disguises itself as purpose. Nietzsche wouldn't deny the value of surrender. He knew life requires risks, that to love or create always involves some kind of exposure, vulnerability. But what he would denounce is the point where this surrender transforms into denial. When desire, instead of amplifying life, narrows it, when the fire that should illuminate begins to burn from within. The moment of surrender is decisive because it reveals which side we're on. If conscious, we can transform passion into creation, into force that strengthens us. If blind, we fall into the submission that weakens us. This is the thin line that separates love as power from love as prison. And perhaps the most difficult question is this: how many times have you believed you were loving fully when, in truth, you were just accepting to erase yourself? How many times was your surrender secretly submission? Romantic love is one of humanity's most powerful cultural inventions. From ancient poems, songs, and stories, we learn to believe there's someone destined for us, a soulmate who will complete what we lack. This narrative seems beautiful, almost divine. But for Nietzsche, it carries within itself a dangerous trap: idealization. To love, when we idealize, ceases to be an encounter with the real and transforms into escape. Instead of seeing the person as they are, we see in them a reflection of our desires, a canvas where we project our own deficiencies. Passion, in this scenario, gains even more deceptive contours, because romantic love doesn't just promise intensity, but promises meaning. It convinces us that the other is the center of our life, the reason for our existence, and thus easily we fall into submission. Not because the other obliges us, but because we believe living for them is the noblest way to live. Idealization makes renunciation an act of glory. Nietzsche would denounce this illusion as a form of decadence. When we idealize someone, we don't actually love that person, but a phantom we created. We desire not the real being, but an imagined version that gives us security, hope, or meaning. And worse is that the more we idealize, the more dependent we become. Because the more we deposit in the other the promise of our completeness, the less we can bear the idea of their absence. Idealization is, therefore, the quickest path to submission. How many times haven't we heard phrases like, "You are everything to me," or "Without you I am nothing"? They seem declarations of absolute love, but actually reveal a state of emotional slavery. Nietzsche would see in this not love's grandeur, but the weakness of one who abdicates their own life to live through another. By idealizing, passion transforms into idolatry. And every idol, sooner or later, demands sacrifice. This illusion is reinforced by the culture that surrounds us. The love stories that formed us rarely speak of imperfect encounters, real coexistence, limits and flaws. They sell us happy endings, magical fusions, eternal loves. We grow up believing that to love is to find the lost half, as if we were incomplete beings searching for the missing piece. Nietzsche would reject this idea vehemently, because for him, human beings shouldn't seek to complete themselves in another, but become whole by themselves. Passion that's born from lack is always dangerous, because it transforms the other into crutch, into magical solution for our fragilities. A daily example can show this dynamic. Think of someone who enters a relationship believing they've found the love of their life. Soon they begin projecting onto their partner all expectations to be source of joy, security, meaning. At first, this surrender seems sweet, even poetic. But when the other fails to correspond to all these demands, because they always fail, pain, resentment, frustration emerge. What was once idealization transforms into demand. Love that seemed absolute reveals its dark face, the need to mold the other to the image of the dream. And when they don't fit, the relationship becomes a battlefield of struggle, resentment, and suffering. Nietzsche knew that resentment is born from the inability to deal with reality as it is. Romantic love, by relying on idealizations, is condemned to produce resentment, because no human being is capable of sustaining the burden of being perfect, of embodying the role of savior or completing another. Passion, when contaminated by naive romanticism, inevitably becomes fragile, and the more fragile, the more it demands submission to maintain itself. But Nietzsche didn't propose cynicism as an alternative, nor the coldness of one who never allows themselves to love. What he proposed was the courage to love without illusions, to love not as one who seeks an idol, but as one who recognizes the beauty and brutality of the real. To love not as one who seeks to complete themselves, but as one who affirms their own life and chooses to share this force with another. It's a love that doesn't demand submission because it's not born from lack, but from abundance. This type of love is rare because it requires maturity and courage. It requires bearing imperfection, difference, solitude within the relationship. It requires abandoning the idea of destiny and assuming the conscious choice to remain, not out of necessity, but out of creation. It's a love Nietzsche would call affirmative, because it doesn't rely on illusions, but on full acceptance of life with its pains and limits. The danger of romantic love is that it masks dependence as devotion, illusion as eternity. But when we open our eyes, we realize that to truly love isn't to find someone to complete us, but someone with whom we can expand ourselves. And this difference is what separates passion that strengthens us from passion that enslaves us. And perhaps the question remains, have you been loving real people, or have you been falling in love with your own idealizations? Passion begins as a breath of life, but can end as suffocation. At desire's peak, we believe we're more alive than ever. But if we look carefully, we'll see that often it's at this peak that the self begins to die. Nietzsche saw clearly this risk. When passion ceases to be creative impulse and converts into annulment of one's own will, at this point, love doesn't magnify but impoverishes. It ceases to be affirmation of strength and transforms into silent submission, into loss of individuality. How many stories have we heard of people who, upon entering an intense relationship, radically changed their way of being? Friends left aside, dreams forgotten, interests abandoned. What seemed to be love becomes, little by little, disappearance. The we swallows the I, and identity comes to depend entirely on the other's gaze. Nietzsche, with his call, "Become who you are," would cry out against this dissolution. Because whoever loses themselves in another ceases to become, ceases to flourish, ceases to live affirmatively. The curious thing is that this death of individuality doesn't usually come from external impositions. Often it's voluntary. Whoever falls in love believes they're offering the greatest gesture of love by renouncing themselves. But what seems grandeur is, in truth, cowardice. Incapable of sustaining their own solitude, the person prefers to disappear into the other's life. Passion becomes anesthesia against the weight of existence, and the price is freedom itself. Nietzsche would invite us to see in this a symptom of weakness. For him, living requires strength, requires bearing the burden of autonomy. To surrender to another as one who flees from themselves is an act of decadence, not grandeur. And yet how many times aren't we taught to believe the contrary? Romantic culture exalts exactly this gesture, losing oneself in love, living for another, making them the reason for existing. What seems sublime, Nietzsche unmasks as dangerous. Because in this movement, we don't grow but diminish. Imagine someone who always dreamed of following an artistic career, but upon falling in love, decides to abandon it because their partner doesn't believe in this path. At first, the renunciation is lived as proof of love, but over time, emptiness grows. The self, amputated from its deepest desires, becomes shadow. What should be an encounter of two creative forces becomes a dissolution process. This is the portrait of passion when it kills individuality. A life that could flourish but chose to atrophy. Nietzsche believed that true love should strengthen singularity, not erase it. The encounter with another should be impulse for growth, not reduction. But for this, courage is needed. Courage to remain faithful to oneself even within passion. Courage to say yes to the encounter without saying no to oneself. This is the difficult frontier, where many fail, because loving seems easier when one abdicates their own will. Passion, when it kills individuality, generates yet another devastating effect: resentment. The person who erases themselves for another, sooner or later, feels the weight of their renunciation. What seemed like free choice begins to sound like sacrifice, and love, instead of being source of joy, becomes source of bitterness. Nietzsche saw in resentment one of the soul's greatest diseases, the inability to assume one's own choice, preferring to blame the other for the life one didn't dare to live. This death of the self can happen so subtly that we don't even notice. It's present in small concessions that accumulate, in silences that swallow words, in dreams we keep postponing. Until, on any given day, we no longer know who we are outside that relationship. And perhaps this is passion's greatest danger, not the suffering of abandonment, but forgetting oneself. Nietzsche would remind us that to live is to create, to affirm, to expand. Any passion that destroys this possibility isn't grandeur, but prison. To love shouldn't mean disappearing, but intensifying one's own being. If love's price is the loss of individuality, then it's not love, but disguised submission. And thus, the inevitable question arises: what have you let die in passion's name? Your singularity, your dreams, your inner voice? Or has your passion been force that amplifies your life instead of narrowing it? Nietzsche didn't write to destroy passion, but to reveal its risks and, above all, its possibilities. Passion, when lived blindly, converts into submission and decadence. But when looked at with lucidity, it can become the most powerful force of creation. The problem is never the intensity, but how we deal with it. What kills isn't the fire, but the inability to transform it into light. Transforming passion into creation means first unmasking its illusions, setting aside the belief that to love is to complete oneself, that to surrender is to disappear, that to idealize is the same as valuing. Nietzsche invites us to love without veils, without masks, without childish romanticisms. This requires courage because it means accepting the other as they are imperfect, limited, flawed, and even more, accepting ourselves with the same marks. Passion only becomes creative when it's born from abundance, not lack. When we love because we overflow, not because we are empty. Love that creates doesn't ask for submission, it asks for expansion. It doesn't demand someone abdicate their singularity, but celebrates the encounter of two forces that remain intact. It's like a dance. There's no absolute fusion, but movement together. Two bodies that meet without ceasing to be two wills that cross without nullifying themselves. This love is rare because it requires maturity, requires bearing the weight of difference, requires living tension without reducing it to dependence. Nietzsche believed that life must be affirmed in its totality, with its contrasts, pains, and imperfections. Passion, seen under this optic, is a field of experimentation. Instead of being prison, it can be laboratory of creation. The encounter with another doesn't need to be submission, it can be stimulus. It doesn't need to be escape, it can be challenge. It doesn't need to be idolatry, it can be sharing of forces. What determines the direction isn't passion itself, but how we conduct it. Think of two people who meet not to fill a void, but to multiply the energy they already possess. Each maintains their project's desires, freedom, but finds in the other a mirror that doesn't imprison, but provokes. In this relationship, there's no need for annulment, because there's no illusion of completeness. There exists the joy of coexisting, of walking together without losing one's own step. This is passion, transformed into creation. It doesn't suffocate, but inspires. For Nietzsche, to live thus is an act of grandeur, because it requires not just intensity, but also strength to resist the temptation of submission. It requires vigilance against self-deception, against the desire to dissolve in the other. It's easier to disappear, easier to idolize, easier to depend. Difficult is to love while remaining whole, to remain faithful to oneself within passion's storm. But it's in this difficult that true power is born. Transforming passion into creation also means learning from it. Each time we fall in love, we have before us a mirror that reveals our strengths and weaknesses. We see how much we're capable of desiring, of risking, of surrendering. But we also see how much we're fragile, how much we fear solitude, how much we're willing to bend to not lose. If we have courage to look at this, passion ceases to be just a cycle of illusion and pain and becomes a path of self-knowledge. Nietzsche would say this process is part of self-overcoming, using passion not as excuse to flee from oneself, but as opportunity to become stronger. Each passion can imprison us, but can also teach us to live more consciously. Each relationship can be submission, but can also be creation. Destiny isn't written. We decide if we'll erase ourselves or affirm ourselves. And perhaps this is passion's true meaning, not to save us, but to test us, not to complete us, but to challenge us. Not to make life easier, but more intense, more real, more full. When we can live like this, passion ceases to be trap and becomes vital force. The question that remains then is this: are you ready to transform your passion into creation, or will you continue allowing it to be prison? We've reached the end of this journey through passion's shadows and lights. Nietzsche taught us that passion isn't an innocent state, nor a simple romantic delirium. Its force, struggle of wills, field of power. When lived without consciousness, it drags us to submission, to loss of individuality, to silent death of the I. But when looked at with lucidity, passion can be transformed into creation, into impulse of growth, into affirmation of life. We learned that passion fascinates us by promising freedom, but often delivers us to servitude. We saw how it hides under masks of romantic love, how it seduces us with promises of completeness, and how, without realizing, we can lose ourselves in idealizations and dependencies. But we also saw there exists another path, that of affirmative passion, one that doesn't ask for submission but stimulates greatness. And now, reflection turns to you. What was the belief about love and passion that most imprisoned you until today? If this journey stirred your thoughts, share in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know how far this philosophy is reaching. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because here we build together a community that thinks deeply, questions illusions, and seeks to live with more consciousness and intensity. Thank you for having walked this far with me. May your passion never be prison, but always creation.